Before we get started, if you've noticed, if you've been here, there's a pot sitting up here on the speaker's podium, and we would like to talk about the reason why it is here. In late fall, Valerie Goodness and Chris Dunn came to me and said we would like to start a sustainability program here at the university, and we have talked with Dean Salwasser about it at the Department of Forestry. And he's very interested in what we might have to say about bringing two sciences together, the traditional science and the westernized science, and how we can blend those two realms of understanding and be in collaboration with one another. And so we were looking for speakers, and I said, well, when you find someone to speak, and I gave some suggestions as to who to speak, let me know. And they came and asked me to speak. And so I did. So one of the things that we talked about was the loss of knowledge. Some tribal nations are lucky in that they have all their stories and then they have all their knowledge. And other people are not so lucky. Through acculturation and assimilation that has taken place in the United States since colonization, there have been many losses of language and traditional ways among tribal people. So I brought in this old polychrome pot, this very, very old pot, that my twin daughters had broken at one point and glued back together for fear that I would find out. But with the cracks in it, it represented the knowledge that my grandmother had. My grandmother was born in 1882. And with those cracks, it showed the loss of knowledge just from my great-grandmother to my grandmother. And so, holding that pot, we dropped it on the floor. And we picked up a shard, and that represented the knowledge that I have. How much has been lost over those generations? How much language has been lost? How many traditions have been lost? How many stories have been lost? And we mourn the losses of traditional knowledge. After the pot was dropped, we invited everyone at the cabin out on Forest Service land, College of Forestry land, to come up and take the responsibility of helping us bring the knowledge back together. My grandmother once told me when I was 13, she said, in order to save what we have, we're going to have to couple and pair with the people who have different knowledge. In order to save what we hold dear to us, we're going to have to blend the two sciences together so that we can fix things, or at least stop the progress of some things that are already in motion. That was in 1970. My grandmother saw a lot of technology changes through her lifetime. So recently, the shards started coming back together for this pot, and we started putting it back together. And as you can see, some of the people who had responsibility for the shard for this pot did not come back. It's a lesson. It's a lesson to us all on knowledge that can be lost and what can be repaired, and what we can search for to bring back the lessons of the past, including language. So this is why this pot is here. Dean Salwasser, out of the goodness of his heart, has also given this pot a home in the College of Forestry, and those with shards will be able to return them. So we were all witness to each other to know that we would work together in kind in a collaboration of like-minded people with different worldviews, to know that it was okay to have different worldviews and different opinions, but to bring knowledge forward. And with that, I would like to introduce Dean Salwasser. He's going to speak with us about wolves. Thank you.
We're able to get that on? No, I've got a wobbler. Technology is failing us here. Is it something up here, Chris?
It's starting.
Oh, it's starting. Okay, we'll just take a few seconds. I was very pleased this morning to see how many people turned out for the conference, and I hope many of them will drift back in as the day goes on. I had 2 meetings scheduled on top of this, so I had to duck out for almost all of this morning. And I'm going to have to go to another one when Jamie and I are through. But I hope to be back for the last part of the Klamath dam removal session. Okay. It's a real honor to be asked to speak at this gathering, and a real special honor to be able to join my friend Jamie Pinkham, whom I've worked with for many years, on this panel on wolves. My task is to offer a Western scientific perspective. I'm going to actually describe 3 different views on wolves, only one of which is scientific, but it's important to sort of cover the spectrum. I'm going to start with something that may strike you as a bit odd, but it's about what science tells us about humanity over the long sweep of time. And it's important because it puts today into context. The details up here are not important. The general story is important. Archaeologists estimate that pre-modern hominids, they call them Homo erectus, evolved in Africa about 2 million years ago. What amazes me is that they had invaded Eurasia by 1.5 million years ago, and then they disappeared around 500,000 years ago. Another species, closer to current humans, appeared in Africa while Erectus was present in Africa and Eurasia. And it was about 1 million years ago. And then it repeated the Eurasian invasion, perhaps as early as 700,000 years ago, and they eventually displaced Erectus. This species is believed to be ancestral to all subsequent humans. And I want you to notice the big, bold, black words. Pyro, hunter, gatherer, with some advanced tools. Then, in Eurasia only, out of this Heidelberg man, and southern Eurasia at that, Neanderthals pop on the scene around 150,000 years ago. This is probably about the time of the start of the last interglacial. Lasted about 25 or 30,000 years. So we've got Neanderthal occupying southern Europe and parts of Eastern Asia, Western Asia, I'm sorry. And they make it through the glacial maximum. So they're obviously cold adapted, more sophisticated tools. They had a very interesting hunting technique. Some of the animal behaviorists and people who study anatomy have figured out that Neanderthals hunted in pairs. One man would run and jump on a big animal and hold on to the hair, infuriating the animal, while the other one ran underneath it and stabbed it from underneath. They found all kinds of fossils with broken bones that had healed. That's how they figured that out. So, meanwhile, back in Africa, Heidelbergensis evolves into modern humans about 90,000 years ago, and they fill up the place and start leaving. And so the European invasion is repeated again. By 30,000 years ago, Neanderthal is no more. Humans now occupy every land area of the planet. We are nature's most successful invasive species. And like all effective invasive species, we are not benign occupants of our habitats. We change them. What's common to these pre-human and human lineages is that they all hunted animals. Many of them fished. They all gathered plants, berries, fruits, and roots. And they all used fire extensively. This is going back to Erectus even. They used fire to aid in the hunt, to disfavor their enemies, or shape the landscapes in their favor. And the animals that ate their prey, or ate them at times, were targeted for reduction. And this included wolves. This relationship between humanity and wild nature was not without consequence. This amazing graph appeared in a paper last year. It shows that the date of first arrival of fully modern humans coincides with the last fossil presence of very large mammals, the Pleistocene megafauna. It's the solid line with the dots on it. And you can see that when humans got to Australia about 50 to 60,000 years ago, the big marsupials disappear. When they got to North America, South America, same thing. When they got to New Zealand, very few years ago, the flightless birds were eliminated. So this Pleistocene megafauna extinction happened in Europe, parts of Asia, Australia, North and South America, and more recently oceanic islands. It did not happen in parts of Africa and Asia until fairly recently. The process is still in motion. And big critters like rhinoceroses and elephants do not inhabit the whole landscape that they did a mere several hundred years ago. Scientists believe that it was a combination of increasingly sophisticated weapons crafted only by modern humans, larger populations, and fire. Fire transformed habitats that all kind of ganged up to cause these extinctions. It wasn't climate change. That graph I showed you, that line is totally unrelated to climate change. Large mammals survived only where primitive hunting technologies and poor accessibility gave them the advantage over their human predators. So hunting is literally in our genes, and so is fire. We would not be the sort of people we are biologically had we not evolved with both hunting and the use of fire. In fact, it's possible we wouldn't even be here. Today, many in America, though not all, don't rely on hunting for subsistence. And today, for many, hunting and other interactions with wildlife have taken on ethical concerns about means and ends. What methods are used, what outcomes are achieved. It has not always been this way. Conservation as we know it in America is only about 125 years old. Wolves were not purposefully brought back to landscapes in the United States until the mid-1990s, led by a very bold group of people in the Nez Perce who brought them back to Idaho. So our story of interacting with wildlife and big predators in particular is old, and it's changing right before our eyes. Now, through all of Eurasian history, wolves have been especially targeted because they ate human prey species, and at times they ate humans. Some pretty incredible records from Italy and France about how extensively wolves preyed on little children and shepherds in the 1700s. This anti-wolf inclination was actually present in some native cultures, and it was certainly brought to the continent by the first Eurasian invaders. And it remains a predominant, though not universal, attitude in many, if not most, rural parts of our nation, including on some Native American reservations. I have a grad student working in Glacier, Waterton, and studying wolves with radio collars, and she has told me that a wolf that wanders east out of Glacier National Park does not last long on the Blackfeet Reservation. So, like everybody else, the Native Americans have a variety of opinions probably about anything. So this is the first view. View number one is that wolves are to be eliminated as threats to things people value. This is not a scientific view, and it's a view that in the extreme may lead to simplified ecosystems, perhaps systems that are also less resilient to change. That aspect, though, is still under examination. So let's go to view number two, other end of the spectrum. Wolves are benign, adorable, even noble creatures, non-threatening to human life, and they should only be persecuted when threatening property, principally livestock, and maybe even then, not at all. This view is increasingly held by urban and some rural nature-first aficionados. It is not realistic. Wolves are large predators. They're not cuddly little dogs. They can and will, if allowed, learn how to use people as prey. Like view number one, it also is not scientific. So let's close with the third view, the ecological view, that wolves, as the apex or keystone predators, can have significant effects on the structure, composition, and function of the ecosystems they inhabit. And those effects are highly variable. Depends on the terrain, it depends on how many different kinds of prey, it depends on how many wolves are present. So it's variable from negligible to dramatic. This third ecological view emerged from scientific work that was begun 1920s, 1930s by individuals like Aldo Leopold and Charles Elton. And it's been rekindled lately at various universities and federal agencies, and most notably in the Lake States in the West, even more notably at Oregon State University. And it's possible, in fact, highly probable, that this ecological view was present in some cultures even before science began trying to understand how the world works. These ecological effects of wolves are called trophic cascades. Wolves eat ungulates. Ungulates eat plants that serve as habitat for other species. When you have enough wolves to reduce the number of ungulates or change their foraging behavior, the palatable shrubs and herbs survive and become habitat for songbirds and butterflies and various other critters. More wolves leads to a biologically diverse ecosystem by keeping browsing and grazing animals from excessive herbivory on palatable plants such as aspen and willow. So this is the scientific or ecological view. It doesn't say wolves are always good. It doesn't say wolves are always bad. It just says what wolves in an ecosystem can do and what might happen if you take them out. Science leaves the ethical issues of when, where, and how many for society to address. Science can and should, though, inform the cultural dialogue about what the answers will be to when, where, and how many. Because every social choice has consequences, and people should know the likely ecological, economic, and ethical consequences of the choices they're pondering. So I will stop here and turn it to Jamie Pinkham to tell you the rest of the story.
Thanks, Hal. Well, thank you, Hal. Actually, I'm a graduate of Oregon State. Got out of here back in 1981, back when we had one basketball coach, Ralph Miller, and we're ranked #1 in the nation in basketball, and actually ranked #1 in the nation in football, but it was #1 in the bottom 10. And I think we went through 3 football coaches the 4 years that I was here, and actually I have a soft spot for Oregon State and Corvallis. My oldest daughter was born here when I was in college, and when she was a little girl, she'd refer to this place as Oregon State of the Universe, and I still think it is. Well, I'm from Idaho, Nez Perce tribe, and the wolf reintroduction effort in Idaho will remain one of the highlights of my career. And being from Idaho, let me set the stage for you. I'm not going to talk about so much the science of it, but I want to talk about the traditional ecological knowledge, but also the politics of it. You know, in Idaho, life is tough if you're a salmon. Life is tough if you're an Indian. Life is tough if you're an environmentalist, and life is tough if you're a Democrat. But try being a salmon-eating Indian environmental Democrat like me. Life is extremely difficult. You know, I appreciated the comments this morning, the reflections on stories, and to me, stories are important. As a friend of mine, Will Rogers, is fond of saying, is that, you know, in this age of mass communication, the information highway, data transfer, technology moving faster than we can comprehend it, is that stories do what no other forms of communication can. Stories get through to our hearts with what matters the most. And so I appreciate the stories that were told this morning, because I think what I'm going to do is share sort of a story with you, how the Nez Perce got involved with the reintroduction of the gray wolf in Idaho. But let me begin far back in time, and it's a reflection of some of the things that were shared this morning. According to my grandfather, there was a time when all the animals could talk. And the Creator called them all together. And if any of you have ever visited the Nez Perce Reservation, you leave Lewis in Idaho, and right when you cross the reservation boundary on the south side of the Clearwater River, there's this rock formation. And that's where the Creator called all the animals together. And he told them that a great change was coming, and that some of these creatures would not survive the great change. But he called all the animals together and said they had to qualify themselves for when this great change would occur. So as Eric was sharing with you this morning, all the animals came forward to the Creator to qualify themselves. You know, first comes the salmon, and the salmon, you know, tells the Creator that you know, when this great change happens, this new creature, you know, they can take flesh from my body to feed themselves, and from my skin that there would be glues for fastening their tools. And so Creator agreed, salmon qualified. Deer came forward. All the animals in the universe came together and qualified themselves. And eventually the great change did occur. And this new creature emerged on a landscape, kind of weak and hungry and lacking wisdom. But all those creatures who pledged stepped forward to care for this new creature called the human beings. But now the animals could no longer talk. And they left the talking up to this new creature to provide for them, to care for them, to give something back. You know, in the Nez Perce, we believe that we were the last, therefore the youngest creatures put on this planet. You know, in that birth, we're giving some wisdom, some knowledge, but not all the skills and information, wisdom needed to survive in this world. So who do you turn to gain this wisdom, to find this strength? You turn to the older living beings, those being the plants and animals that were here long before us. And so when you know, Idaho was moving forward, or trying to prevent actually the reintroduction of the wolf to the state, the Nez Perce tribe Because traditionally, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, when they're working under the Endangered Species Act, they generally look to the state fish and wildlife agencies to be their primary partner. But Idaho really didn't want to have wolves back in the state. And I always felt that the wolf, the history of the wolf and the history of the Nez Perce mirrored one another. Because as was shared this morning, wolves were seen as a threat to as Hal was talking about, a threat to this new immigration coming across the landscape. They would prey on the cattle, the livestock. They would be obstacles, and the people feared them. But also, I think the new immigrants saw the Nez Perce the same way. We were obstacles on this landscape, occupying this land that they wanted to have access to. So both the wolf and the Nez Perce were dispossessed. The wolf was basically eradicated out of the state. The Nez Perce, through treaties and warfare, we were confined to a smaller reservation, and we entered our winter time. Both the wolf and the Nez Perce entered our winter time. But over time, we started seeing the tribe develop this capacity, relying on traditional ecological knowledge, but understanding if we really wanted to make a difference in land management, we had to evolve. And the first evolution with the Nez Perce, because of our treaty reserved rights, is we started to do legal challenges, fighting for our rights to harvest salmon and to hunt deer and elk. And so the tribe developed this legal sophistication to defend our treaty rights. And those treaties were actually, our forefathers, when they negotiated the treaties, they wanted to maintain a way of life for future generations of Nez Perce. It was for sustainability purposes that they negotiated these treaties. And so we had the legal means to defend our treaty rights. And with time, as things were changing, and this evolution with competing social values were taking place on the landscape, because you had, as Mary Wood would say, you had the politics of scarcity. When people thought this world was full of natural resources, abundant resources, man was just simply squaring off with nature, how to conquer nature. But as resources started to dwindle, man began competing with other men over this politics of scarcity as resources began to dwindle. And so the tribe then had to become sophisticated in the political affairs of the world. How do we advance the tribe's needs dealing with state legislatures and in halls of Congress? So we see this evolution from the legal status to the political status. But then we needed to make another leap. And Eric covered this leap quite well, I felt, this morning, into science and technology. Because if we couldn't master the management, the Western science management, the states would be in charge of managing these resources, and state management would always favor the values, the rights of Indian country. And so tribes started to develop the scientific capabilities and expertise to advance. Because, for example, when it comes to the salmon wars, whoever controls the data controls the harvest. So the tribe stepped forward to get the scientific credibility to collect the data to manage our tribal fisheries and to make sure that we shared equitably in the harvest. And so we saw this sophistication. So Nez Perce went through this evolution. And we were proving that we had the technical capabilities to be prudent land managers. Well, our homeland, Nez Perce homeland, covers actually about 13 million acres of land, most of north central Idaho, southeastern Washington, northeast Oregon. And all along we were trying to get a stronger foothold in the wildlife management and fisheries management that was going on. So it came to the wolves. We had an administration that was favorable to wolf reintroduction, and that was the Clinton administration. Bruce Babbitt was the Secretary of Interior. And they developed their wolf reintroduction plan, and as the federal government usually does, they took it to the Idaho Department of Fish and Game. And Idaho, the feeling of the Fish and Game Agency was, they didn't really like to have wolves, but boy, they better be responsible for managing these wolves if it's going to be reintroduced. However, the state legislature required Idaho, the Fish and Game Department, to prepare a wolf reintroduction plan that would be passed by the legislature. Well, anybody could predict what the outcome was going to be. It was the veto authority of the legislature. So when Idaho Fish and Game prepared the wolf reintroduction plan, took it to the legislature didn't pass it. Basically feeling that this nonsense of bringing wolves back to Idaho would just go away. But here was the Nez Perce tribe. All along, we wanted to be a principal player in this. Well, the Fish and Wildlife Service had a record of decision to move forward with wolf reintroduction, and they could no longer ignore the Nez Perce tribe. So they approached us to be their partner. And it was the first time in this country that an Indian tribe had the sole responsibility, the lead responsibility of reintroducing a species under the Endangered Species Act. And we took the reintroduction effort not just to focus on tribal lands and not just to focus on our ancestral treaty lands, but across the state. And it took a lot of discussions with the Fish and Wildlife Service because they've never worked with an Indian tribe in this way. And so we had to go through a series of negotiations and to prove that we were capable of doing this. And we finally were able to sign an agreement, and the first year we started the recovery effort. We helped locate 35 Canadian wolves into Idaho. And we ran into some political barriers. There was a congresswoman, well, she liked to be congressman, we called congressman, who tried to prevent the Forest Service from allowing us to access those lands to release the wolves. So there's continuously these attempts trying to thwart the reintroduction effort. But we're able to move forward to release the wolves. The state legislature responded and said, you know, these are foreign wolves. You know, early immigration policies. All these foreign wolves need to be removed from the state of Idaho because they came from Canada. And so you see the legislature passing actions, one, to prevent Idaho Fish and Game from participating in the effort, and two, calling upon the federal government to remove these foreign wolves. So Idaho all along was leaning against the tribe. And they were actually pretty upset with the tribe for taking on the wolf reintroduction effort. But we knew that, you know, the wolf biology part was the easy part. It was the social sciences and the political science which we knew were going to be the challenges. And so when we did the reintroduction, our biologists, and I am extremely proud of the biologists that the Nez Perce tribe brought into this issue. And the biologists were asked to go out and not to avoid the people, but get out and meet the people. Working with the livestock industries, working with outfitters and guides to get to know them, to communicate with them. Because they began to realize there was no way that they could turn back the tide of these wolves coming home to Idaho. And so our biologists they were constantly on the ground. And it was interesting because the livestock industry, while they didn't agree with us, they appreciated the fact that we could keep them informed on the movements of the wolf population. As the packs would grow and disperse, we had them radio collared, so we could give them real-time information as perhaps a wolf was moving into a grazing allotment. We could get a hold of the allottee and share the information, and if they needed to put more dogs out or do more monitoring, they could. And so not keeping them in the dark was important to us. So we began to develop these relationships with people. And then I got the good news and the bad news from one of our biologists, and he said, the good news is the wolves are recolonizing Idaho faster than we thought. I said, well, great, what's the bad news? The bad news is the wolves are recolonizing Idaho faster than we thought. And what it was doing, it was beginning to stretch our capabilities to monitor the wolves as populations kept expanding. As a matter of fact, one wolf, I think we called her B37, swam the Snake River into Oregon. Yeah. Into Baker, Oregon. And it was in the wintertime. And then we were getting calls to get over there again and get this wolf out of eastern Oregon and get it, capture it and bring it back into Idaho. But it was the winter time and we couldn't get the flights up, and so we thought, well, just naturally, the wolf will make it back. And I remember getting Bill Shake was the assistant regional director for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I don't know how many of you have ever read Willamette Week, the weekly magazine in Portland. Well, somebody had put a personal relationship ad in Willamette Week, and it said, "Female looking for long-term relationship. Must be a carnivore, must be willing to relocate to Oregon." And somebody actually was looking, because that's why the female came over here, was looking for a partner. So actually somebody put a personal ad in Willamette Week trying to find it a partner. But the wolf eventually made it back. But then our trouble, we recognized that as the wolf populations were growing, making use of the natural landscape of Idaho, there was tremendous, abundant habitat. It was really stretching our abilities to keep track of the movement of the wolves and as new packs were forming. And we had to go and ask the Fish and Wildlife Service for additional funds. And Jamie Clark was the director of the Fish and Wildlife Service in D.C. in those days. And we met with her and we said, we need more funding so we can continue to monitor these wolves as they expand across Idaho. And she said, you got to go to the budget writers. You got to go to Congress. And at the time, Dirk Kempthorne was the senior senator. No, he was not. Larry Craig was a senior senator. But Dirk Kempthorne was in the U.S. Senate. And we knew that to get Kempthorne convinced is that we needed to go back to Idaho and try to gain some support to ask for additional funding. And so we went back to those relationships that the biologists had created with the livestock industry. And then we went to the governor of Idaho, and I remember sitting down with the chairman in his office, and we said, Governor, we need your help. We need you to help us get additional funding to do the wolf monitoring effort. Most politicians would say, well, God, wouldn't this be a great opportunity to kill the program? Kill it through attrition of appropriations? But I think they recognized the fact that there was no turning the tide back again. And I remember the governor's comment to me, he says, Jamie, I never liked those damn things, but as long as they're here, let's do a good job of managing them. The governor supported the appropriations request, wrote the letter, Kim Thornton inserted bill language, and we got the money to do additional monitoring. And my greatest fear through this whole thing was not the state of Idaho and what the state of Idaho might do. The state of Idaho played their card early on. We knew where their interests were. But my concern with the Nez Perce role in wolf recovery was the federal government. They were the ones that stepped out and took a leap of faith and invested in us. But certainly, what would happen if there was a change in administrations? We had 2 wonderful years of Bruce Babbitt, Jamie Clark, and under the Clinton administration. And sure enough, when the change in administration came and President Bush had selected a former attorney general from the state of Colorado as the Interior Secretary, and the interests that she carried were more states' rights, states' interest, we saw the erosion of the Nez Perce leadership in wolf reintroduction. And it was amazing to me because it was like the mirror of that journey between the Nez Perce and the wolves continued again. Because with the state asserting more control over wolf management, it was to protect state interests, not wolf interests, not Nez Perce tribal interests. So we saw the tribe's role being decreased to where it is today. And maybe it's 50-50, but it used to be 100% was ours. And so Idaho has taken a major lead in the wolf recovery effort. They developed a delisting plan and moving forward with delisting, and the first thing that happened was the harvest of wolves. Idaho declared open season on wolves, and Governor Butch Otter stood on the steps of the state capitol, and he wanted the first permit to hunt wolves. We didn't go through this effort to annihilate wolves. Why would we go about doing this to exploit the natural resources, to fight so hard with putting our knowledge on the line, putting our best science forward to see wolf populations just become a trophy species again. But honestly, I don't think they were hunted as a trophy. They were hunted out of anger again. You read the letters to the editor in the papers of Idaho, and it's about anger and frustration about how the federal government had taken this resource and shoved it down the state's throats. They don't own those lands. Those federal lands, species listed under the Endangered Species Act, don't belong to a single state. They're national assets. Those federal lands, listed salmon, become the interest of all Americans and not governed by a single state. And so we see continuing gridlock going on. I sit on the board of Defenders of Wildlife. We've filed suit, hoping that we'll get a favorable ruling out of the judge in, I think it's early June is when we're thinking the judge is going to make a ruling on Idaho's harvest and the delisting of the wolves. But what we would hope that as time goes on, that this is the kind of chaos that we see. We see such a diverse set of values, the tribe's interest in bringing back all species back into the landscape. Certainly, the first foods that are vital to us, but there's also those other species that are important to the identity of not just the Indian people, but also the identity of the landscape. You cannot have wilderness areas in Idaho without wild salmon and without wolves. We need to replenish the entire landscape to make those lands back to really what we intend them to be. We continue to fight a lot of other issues. Eric talked a little bit about the salmon issues that we continue to fight today. And let me share with you another one that involved traditional foods and medicines. Noxious weeds are spreading across the northern Idaho, and one of the departments under the Department of Agriculture had completed this eradication plan for a noxious weed called common crepina. And I was the tribe's natural resource manager in those days, and so we're looking at the scoping documents, and we commented because they were planning on applying pesticides to control common crepina. And where it was occurring overlaps with many of our traditional foods and medicines. So we submitted comments that we were concerned about the exposure, that when they broadcast these chemicals over the rangeland, that one, it would kill the traditional foods and medicines, and then our women who are out collecting them would be exposed to the toxics of the chemicals. Well, here's how the federal government responded to that. They said that there shouldn't be a concern because certainly if people were out there doing the spray operations, they would be exposed to the chemical, but they would post signs so that we knew when they were spraying and we could avoid those areas. But the remedy was really triggered by this, because if they would apply these chemicals repeatedly, it would kill the traditional foods and medicines that the tribe collected, so we wouldn't be out there collecting them and thus wouldn't be exposed. That was their rationale. Well, we took a hostage on that one. And actually they were embarrassed, but that became, we worked with the state of Idaho to find what are the alternatives to pesticides. And so if you go to the Nez Perce Reservation, we have now a biocontrol facility that uses pathogens and insects to try to control the noxious weeds. But again, it's that evolution, that scientifically we have these solutions. But what I learned here at Oregon State is that in science, the answer isn't always the solution, especially when issues become highlighted culturally, politically, and socially. We need to extend ourselves beyond science to try to find the right way to cure these competitive issues that we have between our communities. So just another one of the examples, we continue to fight these battles every day. But I think when people are looking across Indian country now, they see that no community out west has suffered so much in the face of adversity than Indian tribes. But in a turnabout, no community out west has done more to restore the natural landscape than those same very Indian tribes. And it's because of the combination of that ancient wisdom, the traditional technologies and sciences that we continue to rely upon today. And it comes with the fact that we've developed the sophistication in politics and the legal affairs of this nation, and we've become pretty strong allies. And so we're not afraid of taking the contentious debates like bringing wolves home to Idaho, or fighting for salmon, or fighting for our traditional foods and medicines. So I hope that as you move forward in your careers in trying to be the best resource managers in a time when it seems like civility is what leads our public debates, is that you'll be open to the integrity of traditional ecological knowledge and how it can advance solutions for all of society. And I'll leave it there, and I thank you for your attention. Or for Hal.
Do the Nez Perce get involved in some of these more recent events that are happening in Oregon?
Such as?
Well, I think recently we've been starting to have, I think now 2 or 3. We just had a loss of, I think, a calf a couple of weeks ago. Is that right? Can anybody here help me out? And a couple of years ago, some sheep. And it gets people riled up. So, do the Nez Perce get involved in that, or do they mostly restrict their attention to the Idaho side?
Well, our kind of this relationship on a reintroduction is exclusively with the Idaho population.
Okay.
But if it would happen in our treaty territory, we'd probably have an interest. Actually, because our traditional homelands abut to the area that Eric's working in at Umatilla as well. Mm-hmm. And let me admit, I don't live at Nez Perce anymore. When you look at, I think, the agenda, it has Bush Foundation, and that's not George Bush Foundation. It's not Anheuser-Busch. It's Archibald Bush, who was a former chairman of the executive committee for 3M. So I live in St. Paul, Minnesota now, working for a private nonprofit foundation. So I'm not as in tune as the contemporary issues around wolves going on at Nez Perce right now.
I'm curious for each of you to address how the state of Idaho dealt with the social capacity in terms of big game. The hypothetically inflated numbers for hunting and how that was, woven into this wolf recovery, or did it become an issue at all?
I got my perspective. We looked at that issue because there was a lot of assumptions going on about the decline of the elk populations. And if you look at the environmental factors, the years of fire suppression have affected good quality elk habitat. You've got bears and cougars. We were not denying the fact that wolves were preying on the elk, and there was an impact. But the significance of the impact, we said, we're not sure of. And the worst thing that we could do is assume what the problem is, then you assume what the right solution is, and all we're going to do is make a mistake. So we never were able to get a good, accurate impact on what it is. Because believe me, elk hunting in Idaho, trophy elk hunting, is big business.
There's a couple of concepts in biology that have been used in figuring out population objectives for recovered endangered species, and one of them is known as viability. And it's a viable population is one whose numbers and distribution are sufficient to allow the species to persist in an area for at least 100 years. It's kind of a minimum population number. The other one is called ecologically effective populations, and I used that terminology in my presentation. An ecologically effective population is one whose numbers and distribution is sufficient to result in desired ecosystem conditions. And in the case of wolves, the viable population that was used to set recovery goals and to justify delisting was 30 breeding pairs in the 3 states, Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana. Perhaps a total of 30 times 550, 200 wolves. The states of Montana and Idaho went a little bit better and said, no, we'll set a goal of, our management plans will maintain at least 15 breeding pairs. Until this harvest that was conducted last fall, there were at least 1,600 wolves in the 3 states. And as Jamie said, Idaho and Montana moved very aggressively to hold a hunt the very first year the species was delisted. Montana was a little bit more conservative in its hunt than Idaho, and some very unethical killing practices were discovered. People taking wolves out of season. One group of hunters north of Yellowstone, they were elk hunting, and so they dragged the gut piles over to right near the northern boundary of Yellowstone National Park, and then slaughtered the wolves when they came out to get the gut piles. You haven't seen any of this in the news. It's too hot to put in the press, but these are things that our field scientists have uncovered. So when the delisting proposal was put forward, I'm a member of the Boone and Crockett Club, the old conservation organization that Theodore Roosevelt founded, and I convinced the club that in their conservation legacy they needed to take a stand on wolves. And the stand that we crafted for them was to support delisting and management by the states of huntable populations. And the logic was that if all you had was a viable population that warranted delisting, you did not have a huntable population. To have a huntable population, you needed to have a lot of wolves in a lot of places. And it was kind of a subtle way of getting the hunter conservation community to embrace the fact that wolves belonged in those ecosystems. And Rocky Mountain Elk signed on, Deer Federation signed on, and it was pretty amazing that groups that historically had worked pretty actively to get rid of wolves and keep them out were beginning to take that stand. I tried to get them to send another letter this winter, but I couldn't pull it off. And that letter was to ask the states to ban the harvest of radio-collared wolves that were part of research populations, and to put buffers around the national parks so that the wolves in those areas would be protected, and to encourage the states to set as population objectives for wolves ecologically effective in wilderness and roadless areas, which would mean the wolves get to interact in their more natural way. It was just too hot. They just couldn't get there at the time, but we'll persist and see if we can do that. Now, I wasn't acting as a scientist there. I was acting as a conservation advocate through organizations whose business is to advocate for conservation, but we certainly used the science that we had learned in Yellowstone and Glacier to back up what we were advocating.
Question, Jamie. What was the role of traditional ecological knowledge about geographic reintroduction? Was there, because often I get asked in Northwest California, if we were going to reintroduce certain species, whether it's condor or porcupine or beavers, what traditional ecological knowledge or ethnographic information is available? And I wondered what sources you turned to, whether it was elder council, tribal council, or historical documents to guide that.
Actually, all of the above. And you could even turn to the Lewis and Clark journals when they actually documented the wolves as they came through. So yeah, we went to, and believe me, and I think Hal brought this up too, that we even had controversy inside the tribe when we did that. We have farmers and ranchers in our communities, people who depend on that industry. We have the men who hunt, and they were concerned about the impact to the wildlife, other wildlife species too. So we even had people in a tribe that didn't agree with the route that we were taking. But we asserted that we had the capability. This was our traditional homeland, and that the wolves, as Hal well explained, is that there is a fundamental role that wolves have within this. But another thing which was important to me was, wolf reintroduction was really not about wildlife biology. In the end, it was about restoring a tribal voice to the land. Back across our ancestral homeland from, again, the reflection of how the wolves were removed, we were removed, but this gave us a chance to extend that voice out into our traditional homeland.
Thank you.
I want to add a little bit to what I was describing. The research that's going on in Glacier Waterton, our field biologist there, by the way, she just published a book called The Wolf's Tooth that is getting rave reviews and is already sold out. Its first printing is in a second printing from Island Press. She has an area west of Glacier. It's the North Fork of the Flathead River. It has the highest density of wolves of any of the areas in that park complex. Happens to also have the highest density of elk, the main prey species. Some of her colleagues that have been working in Yellowstone and Isle Royale, where they have long-term data sets, have discovered that the prey, elk in Yellowstone, moose in Isle Royale, that the prey are bigger at a certain age after the wolves were there. And they think the logic is partly that the wolves are picking off the weaker animals, and partly that they're reducing the total numbers so the surviving animals have access to the better quality forage. Now that's going to get the trophy hunters, they'll get their heads turning. They may not have as many to go after, but they're going to be bigger. Some really fascinating things. And what Christina is doing is she's studying 3 different places in the park complex, one with high wolves, one with medium wolves, and one with very low density of wolves. It's that east side area where there's a lot of ranchers. And what she's trying to do is to figure out where's that spot on the curve where you get that ecological effectiveness to begin to kick in and the willows and the aspen are surviving. It's certainly not at 0 wolves, and it may not be at full saturation. But we don't know where it is in between there. And we're hoping that her dissertation research will have enough data to begin to inform the Forest Service, which frankly is more important to the future of wolves than the Park Service, because 90% of the wolves in the Northern Rockies are on national forests. Help them move away from this notion that all they need to do is provide for a viable population, and instead a more ecologically effective population, which, while it's based in science, is really reflective of a lot of what Jamie was talking about restoring some of the natural wildness to the land.